Good afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Kristen Crandall. I work with PolicyMap, and I'm here with Lois Greco from the Wells Fargo Regional Foundation and Ira Goldstein from Reinvestment Fund. And thanks so much for joining us for today's webinar about the risks of gentrification, how to preserve affordability in appreciating markets. So before we get to the main event, I just want to cover a few housekeeping items. This is a go-to webinar, which means that by default, everyone in the audience is muted. So in order to ask us questions, which we hope you ask a lot of, we need you to type them into the GoToWebinar screen. So we can't hear you if you talk. But we do want this to be as much of a discussion and conversation as possible, so we encourage you to type in your questions throughout the webinar, and we'll get to them towards the end in the Q&A. And the second thing I wanted to mention is that the webinar is being recorded, so we will be sending it out after, so you can pass it along to your colleagues who are not able to join. So that's it for now. I'm now going to turn it over to Lois Greco from the Wells Fargo Regional Foundation.
Thank you, Kristen. So as most of you, I think, know, I am Lois Greco, and I am the Evaluation Officer with the Wells Fargo Regional Foundation, here located in Philadelphia. And part of my job is to really be paying attention to what our grantees, you all, have asked to learn more about and have conversations. It's very clear in my travels throughout our 62 counties, we have very different marketplaces that we are working in. But in all of those marketplaces, the concerns about how increasing, appreciating real estate values is affecting the income, the populations that we care about so deeply, the residents in those places, are affected by that real estate appreciation. And so I asked the great Ira Goldstein at the Reinvestment Fund if he would share some of his wisdom and his experience that he has gained over his career in working with affordable housing in these types of places. Ira has been a partner of the Wells Fargo Regional Foundation for over 10 years in helping our grantees understand the markets, in particular the real estate markets, and as they relate to the issues that are near and dear to the residents. So with that, I'm going to let Ira talk about what he's planning to share with us today.
Thank you, Lois, and good afternoon, everybody. Today what we're going to try and do is to spend some time thinking about the ways in which we can look at how markets are changing. We're going to first look at some national trends, and then we'll be able to sort of drill into some methodologies that we've been using here in Philadelphia. And then what we'd like to do is to spend some time going through a wonderful paper that was written by a person at Abt Associates, Jeff Lubell. He put this paper together for a Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia forum on gentrification and neighborhood change. And the reason we think it's really useful for you to get a chance to spend some time with and for us to talk about is that it is really a nice cataloging of the various things that people do around the country as they address things that are related to gentrification and neighborhood change in their communities. But I think what we're also going to try and do is take that work and go just a little bit farther with it to say, you know, there are this set of tools and what other conditions that exist in different places that make them more or less appropriate for the kinds of things that you would like to accomplish. We're going to try and pick a few spots within where we stop for some questions if people want to type them in. But as Kristen mentioned, if you have questions along the way, please type them in and we'll make sure that we address them. So firstly, the data that we're going to talk about here is really looking at both the rental and owner housing stock, and it is just an overview of what the supply, demand, and gap and conditions are for that housing stock. Most of the work here comes from Harvard's Joint Center of Housing Studies, and they do an annual State of the Nation's housing, which gives you an opportunity to look over a relatively long term about a various set of indicators that they've been tracking. In addition, we will look at some data that they put together in one of their rental housing reports, and then the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. The first slides are from the Joint Center. So this slide that you're looking at right now is showing you the distribution of the number of assisted households that have been in the United States from 1983 through 2013. And what you can see is, and these are low-income households, the blue portion is the number that are assisted, and the purple portion are the numbers that are unassisted. And over the course of time, what you're seeing, as reflected in the total height of the bar, is a general increase in the number of households that are low income. What you'll also see is that bar is getting taller. That blue portion is remaining relatively constant, but therefore constituting a smaller portion of the nation's poor households that are receiving assistance. At the end of the period, in essence, what you end up with is a situation where, roughly speaking, 1 in 4 low-income households have the assistance that they need to be able to live in their homes without being overly cost-burdened. This next slide is showing you, again, sort of disentangling a little bit and looking very particularly at renter households. The little purple line represents, in inflation-adjusted terms, renter incomes. So you'll see in inflation-adjusted terms, it has really declined over time, and it has seen a little bit of an uptick in the last couple of years. In some measure, we think that that might be a function of the fact that some of the renter households of today were owner households of before, and they sort of migrated between those two tenure categories. And owners tended to have higher incomes, so when they moved into the renter supply, they caused that to rise just a bit. And that's a result, really, of a variety of things, including the loss of ownership due to foreclosure. The turquoise line on the top is the median housing cost for renter. Then what you'll see is in inflation-adjusted terms, that just continued to rise and rise and rise. As a result, the gray bars show you the percentage of people who are cost-burdened. And now what you're seeing is, in essence, that almost half of renters are cost-burdened. And that is, stands in contrast to at the beginning of the decade, where it was, more like about 40–41%. So it represents a pretty substantial rise. And it's not even across the income distribution. This set of bar charts is representing the percentage who are both moderately burdened, which means households are spending 30 to 49.9%, or severely burdened, meaning they're spending 50% or more of their income on housing. And what we see, if we look at the set of bars all the way to the left, is that currently about 83–85% of the lowest income households, renter households, are cost burdened, and the majority of those are severely cost burdened. In fact, over 70% of those lowest income households are severely cost burdened, meaning they're spending more than 50% of their income on housing. Now, you all know why we care about that, but for those who don't know all the reasons, the main reason is if you have to spend that much of your income on housing, particularly if you're low income, it doesn't seem to leave enough to do all the things that you need to do, like buy clothes for your children, educate them, medical things, all the kinds of things that we all need to do. There just isn't enough left. As the income levels rise, of course, the number and percentage of people who are cost burdened or households that are cost burdened declines, and that's sort of a pretty consistent trend over the course of time. The numbers, again, now this is looking at the entire housing stock and breaking up moderate and severely broken out by owners and renters. And as is pretty much always the case, or at least over the last several years, really the percentage, this is just showing you the numbers, but the percentage of folks who are households that are cost burdened is always going to be higher among renters, and the percentage of households that are severely cost burdened in particular will always be higher. These bars are a little deceptive in that we're looking at raw numbers, and since there's more households that are owner than renter, you don't see that particular pattern, but that is the pattern, is that renters will always be more that the data show that over the course of time, renters have always been more cost burdened. Now what we're looking at is something that speaks to quality, and again, it shouldn't be a big surprise, but people who are particularly low income and who are cost burdened, the housing stock that they live in tends not to be as high quality as other folks, and frankly, If they are not in that assisted portion, in that unassisted but relatively affordable housing stock, those conditions are likely to be less good as well. With public housing authorities and with people who are getting assistance through the Housing Choice Voucher Program, at least, there is some notion of a unit meeting housing quality standards, but that doesn't necessarily apply across the board. And so assisted households oftentimes will be in a better condition. But here what you see is that, you know, the number and share of owners and renters, but particularly renters who are low income and cost burden, who live in poor quality housing, is pretty high. This is different data. I found it interesting, you know, that through the primary season there was all this discussion about raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. This is data that's done every year by the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And basically what they do is they look at what the fair market rents are for housing across the country. And then what they do is they figure out essentially how much you'd have to make to be able to afford a typical two-bedroom at the fair market rate. And what you'll see on here is we have the most expensive jurisdictions, both states, counties, metros, and combined metros. And what you'll see, for example, San Francisco metropolitan area, you need $44.02 an hour if you are only really to work just one job full-time to be able to afford a two-bedroom household. And even if we sort of make our way down to the list of the less expensive ones, you know, you're looking at $31 for Santa Cruz, California, or even state-wise, lowest, you know, the state at the, you know, the relatively high still, but on the lower end of the high, you know, that's still $23 an hour, which stands at, you know, probably 3 times the minimum wage. So our discussion of what minimum wage is now, 7.25, if we're going to raise it to $15 an hour, it's still not going to be enough to stand alone as a way of keeping people in a circumstance where they are not severely or moderately cost burdened. Some of you, I would imagine, are in some of these more expensive areas. Some of the Washington areas are going to be expensive. Some of the New York metropolitan areas are going to be more expensive. And New York as a state alone has one of the higher of the two-bedroom housing wages. Lastly, on this portion, we're just going to show you 2 maps from Policy Map. Any one of these you could have generated as a Wells Fargo Regional Foundation grantee, but we're mapping here counties, and we're looking at the extent to which renters are cost burdened. The map is shaded so that the darker places are places where you have higher percentages of households cost burdened, and in the lighter places, that's where you have lower percentages. And if you just, we're going to flip back and forth on these maps quickly. You're looking at, in this instance, 2005 to 2009, and 2010 to 14. The big takeaway from my perspective is the amount of blue that you see on the chart as we move from 2000 on the map as we move from 2005-9 to 10-14. So that represents, you know, during a period of time where, you know, the housing market itself was relatively flat, the renter circumstance has deteriorated a fair amount. And that's pretty visible in these 2 U.S. maps. Even in some of the very low-priced areas, they sort of bounce up, and you're seeing higher percentages of the households that are cost burdened. So with that, I would like to stop and see if if people have put any questions up, or if this is all still pretty okay. Yeah, I would love to be able to zoom in some, but I can't. But you all with Policy Map can actually do this map yourself, and if you have a problem doing it, either Kristen or Phil or us will be able to help you out to do it. But yes, indeed, these are just static versions, but there are you'll have access to the live maps. And you will get a copy of the presentation. Absolutely. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to talk to you a little bit about an approach that we've developed here in Philadelphia. It really dates back, frankly, to the early, late 1980s, early 1990s, when Philadelphia was going through its first wave of gentrification. And neighborhood and community-based organizations around here who are concerned about what was happening in what's known as the Art Museum area, not too far from where the Rocky statue is. For people who don't know Philly, everybody knows the Rocky statue. That was one of the first places really to experience gentrification in Philadelphia. And the people who were living there were concerned that they, that they were going to see that although the benefit of the rising housing prices, their taxes would go up and there would be no way for them to sustain. Moreover, they were concerned that many of these communities were multi-generational communities, so their grandparents live there, they live there, their children want to live there, and over the course of time, even if their households were doing reasonably well, if the prices were rising faster than their incomes, the ability to replace oneself, if you will, was hampered. So what we tried to do at that time, and we've since refined the measure a good bit, was really focus on that aspect of gentrification that we thought was most concerning, and that was the involuntary aspect of displacement. So in other words, certainly people have issues, when populations change and cultures change and buying patterns change and aesthetics change and all those other things change. But the real actionable concern, in particular from our perspective, and I think from the perspective of what you all do as grantees, is going to be largely focused on, the economics of this stuff and making sure that people have the ability to sort of hang in and have a decent and vital place to be. So we decided what we would do is really focus our attention on what a place looked like at a particular point in time, and then see whether or not the same kind of people economically could continue to sustain in that place over a longer period of time. Now, one thing I would say as a caveat to this is this ratio, this DRR, which I'm going to show you in a moment, or displacement risk ratio, is one that is really focused largely on home sale prices rather than rent levels. We're trying to figure out a way to account for those rent differences. But we believe, and we think that we're on reasonably firm footing, that rents tend to travel price-wise along with home sale prices. So although it's not directly tied to rents, it's reflective of what happens to rents. So how do we do this? And this is actually, it's a remarkably simple thing to do. What you do is you pick a start year. In our particular example that we're going to show you today, we pick as a start year 2000. It's handy because the census data existed in 2000. What we can then do is look at a long period of time and see how areas have changed. So we start with that start year, and then we establish the income levels in each geography over in that start year, and we use census data for that. So you'll know if you use census data for 2000, they're asking you about your income in the year before, which would be 1999. What we then do is we assume that people's incomes would largely just change as a function of the consumer price index or inflation. And so what we do is we fix an area's income and allow it to grow only with inflation or the consumer price index. But what we then do is we get home sales in each of the areas, and what we do is we create 2-year moving averages, which means basically that we put 2 years of data together, and we do that so we can get stable price estimates. And then we look at essentially the ratio of home sale prices to income. And then we make some adjustments for overall changes in the city's rate and the city's rate of change, et cetera. But what you end up with is, in essence, a fraction or a ratio that depicts the ratio of how home sale price is changing over time in relation to how income is for a population that looked like it did at that initial point in time. And again, I think one of the things that distinguishes how we look at this is we don't keep updating that census data, because if you keep updating the census data, what you do is you bring in the influence of all the new people, and thus, essentially thwart your ability to see how the area has changed. So we fix it at that one point in time, we allow the sale prices to change, and then we watch those ratios. And it's that very simple ratio. As I said, we do a little bit of adjustment to account for citywide changes in home sale price, because what you don't want to do is to confuse in some ways the fact that a city is getting more expensive from the very specific and unique aspect of gentrification or displacement, for which we want to attach some of these understandings around equitable development strategies. And that, frankly, was, back when we created this in the late 80s, early 90s, that was some of the ideas. People were trying to figure out what are the things that we could do to help people stay in place as their areas were changing. So we're going to take a look at Philadelphia, since we have the longest period of time there, but hopefully you'll be able to sort of draw from this a way that you could look in your own communities about how they're changing using a very similar tool. So this first graph is one that shows along the horizontal dimension years, so 2000 through 2013. Along the vertical dimension, the y-axis, is that ratio of home sale price to income. And each one of those little colored lines represents a neighborhood in Philadelphia, actually a block group within a neighborhood. And we wanted to show you these four because they represent a very different pattern. Let's start with that little blue line. You'll notice it's actually relatively flat or actually declining. That's a neighborhood called Mayfair, and I'll show it to you in a minute on the map. It's a part of the city of Philadelphia that if you looked at it today, looks like the way it did in 2010, looks like the way it did in 2000, 1990, and 1980. It just hasn't changed at all over time. And the same kind of people economically who lived in there at an earlier point in time can continue to live in there today. If you were to look at, for example, the green one, the green line on the very top, that's an area called Northern Liberties. That actually was one of the areas that back when we created this index, people thought was an area that was gentrifying, but frankly, it didn't happen for a good 20 years thereafter. But you'll notice that that is a trend line that shows, quite frankly, just constant upward trend, meaning that by the time you get, not that far out from that initial point in time, the same kind of people economically who lived in there in 2000 probably couldn't live in there by the time you get to 2003 or 4. So that sort of, that rise in that line really is in some ways a manifestation of that pressure. Now let's look at the red line, and that is an area called Francisville. That's actually, and again we'll show you all these neighborhoods, that's actually a little bit to the east of the Art Museum area, and that's an area that was relatively flat for a reasonably long period of time within this time span, and then all of a sudden in like that 2006, 2008 time period, it just took off. And if you were to look at it today, it bears no resemblance other than its physical location to what it looked like a few years ago. It's completely different. And lastly is that purple line, and that's Point Breeze, and we'll spend a fair amount of time in Point Breeze as part of this example. That's one where, really at about 2002, 2003, it sort of started to take off on its trend. An upward trend, and you'll see a little bit of fluctuation in these things sometimes. Don't forget, although we sort of move the city averages out of the numbers, we're able to sort of still see the a little bit of the result of the recession and the housing boom and the housing bust, but we try and get as much of that out and look at the pure trend. These lines to us are really important because in essence you can think about being able to hopefully identify a trend in a neighborhood or a trend in the areas surrounding a particular neighborhood or in parts of your neighborhood that are manifesting perhaps like that blue Mayfair line, but are physically adjacent to places that are manifesting something not unlike that Point Breeze line. And where you see that, that's the kind of thing that might evidence the kind of market pressure that you would like to be intervening in with the variety of your equitable development tools. So now we'll turn to the maps of Philadelphia. We're looking at the earliest time period, and each one of the little aqua arrows is pointing to those neighborhoods. So the one in the farther northeast, that's that Mayfair line. You'll notice that this map is shaded so that the light colors are representative of the low ratios and the dark colors are representative of the high ratios. So Mayfair is in that low ratio range as you saw on that chart. If we move down clockwise, I guess that takes you into Northern Liberties. And in Northern Liberties, you're still looking at a place that those ratios were still relatively low. We continue clockwise down to Point Breeze, and you'll see that's an area which is still all yellow, which means, and that's what you saw on that chart, on that line chart, that they were still in those low ranges in that time period. And lastly, the one just north of Point Breeze, you'll see that's that Francisville section, and that is, showing mostly in that yellow range. Now, I'm going to actually bounce back and forth a little bit between the beginning of the time period and the later time period so you can see how the places change. So this is 2000, this is 2015. You'll notice, focus your attention first on Mayfair. It has not changed. You see it was yellow, it is yellow. In fact, it actually sort of dropped down a little bit in its categories. But if you were to now move down to that Northern Liberties one, you'll notice it's all brown, which means that those markets have changed so substantially that the people who lived in that neighborhood back in 2000 are likely under significant pressure at this point economically, or the same kind of people who bought in or rented in that neighborhood in 2000 likely couldn't afford to get in there now. If you were to then move down to that Point Breeze area, you'll notice that, you'll notice that most of that has turned brown as well. And Francisville, you'll see what happened in there, and that's that whole expansion of the art museum area. In some ways, what it almost feels like, if you sort of try and draw out the metaphor of sort of lava rolling off of a volcano, sometimes these market pressures actually start to move across these fake geographic lines that are census block groups, and you start to feel that pressure. And we were in, 2 weeks ago, we were in a neighborhood in Houston. Is it Northline area, and that was a place where you could actually begin to see that pressure from certain parts of the market, literally just marching across the street into other parts. This measure is a way of being able to see it. We do this at the block group level, so you can see it actually pretty small, and I think it offers you the ability to start to think about, how is it that we could begin to intervene where that lava is going before it gets in there, right? So now let's really drill into Point Breeze. Oh, where is Germantown? Okay, Germantown is going to be right in and around here. Hopefully you can see my cursor moving. Okay. Lower northwest, right. Okay, so Point Breeze, by the way, if you think about where it says the O in South Philadelphia in the slide title, a little bit above that O would be pretty much Center City. And as you move down, you move through a couple different neighborhoods through the course of time have really changed pretty radically. Point Breeze begins really probably around here or maybe a little bit lower. This, by the way, for folks who are ever going to make their way to Philadelphia who are not from here for conferences or visits or what have you, this has become like the hottest restaurant row in the city, so I suggest you make your way over there, notwithstanding the topic of today's webinar. But in any event, let's look at, we're just going to flip through these pretty quickly, recognize that where we want to pay attention to for purposes of understanding these equitable development interventions is as areas sort of migrate in color on this map from this light cream color on through the yellows and into the browns. So watch how these maps change. Okay. So let's go back again. You'll notice that really the strength of the market, like I said with that lava metaphor, is really sort of pushing down from the north and west from that really that diagonal street, Passyunk Avenue on the east. Watch it again. And I suspect from knowing that some of the neighborhoods that you all are working is that you are probably like that Point Breeze neighborhood where not all of your neighborhood has transformed, but portions of your neighborhood are really starting to feel that market pressure. And I would say also, if you end up coming down and checking out those restaurants on Passyunk Avenue, walk into Point Breeze and you can actually physically see how that area is changing. It's remarkably different even than it was 6 months ago, 12 months ago, 18 months ago. So let me stop here for 1 second and see if there are any questions that we want to address about the ratios. This tool is not in PolicyMap because it requires us to have access to home sale data at a small geography. Some of the cities do have home sale data inside of PolicyMap, so we might be able to create some of this. But either way, what I would suggest is either we work with you to create it, or you think about literally just sort of putting these couple measures together yourselves and watch how that ratios will change over time. But my suggestion is do it spatially. One of the things I think that you all know from the work that you do is we talk about neighborhoods, and we were talking about the Point Breeze neighborhood here in Philadelphia in this example. Neighborhoods tend not to be one thing. They have an identity for sure, but as neighborhoods change and as neighborhoods have sort of established their patterns, I can't think that in my entire life of looking at neighborhoods in any city that we've ever worked in, that any neighborhood is just one thing. And so the idea of being able to sort of carve up your neighborhood to understand where those pressures are coming from is useful, and thus using these small geographies, these census block groups, really are a critical way of understanding that market pressure. And I would venture to say that with your planning folks and with your home surveying and the like, you're going to pick up those differences as you move from block to block across your neighborhoods. But this is an important thing, I think, to recognize that you've got to sort of think about your neighborhood and its identity on the one hand, but also think about how it differentiates internally on the other. Household incomes, the question is, are household incomes from homeless shelters included in this measure? Only if the census is picking up those households as part of their income identification. And I would suggest that probably back in 2000 where we started it, they were way less likely to pick it up at all than they do today if they pick it up at all. So that's probably an underrepresented portion of the population comprising that average. Okay.
How do we account for immigrant households' incomes?
That's interesting. So, part of the thing that you could, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, you're not seeing the screen. The question is, how do we account for immigrant household incomes which may not be accurately reflected in the census? What effect that has is it is definitely a distortion. And the way to think about that distortion is, if those immigrant household incomes were actually in the ratio, they would distort that ratio in such a way that it would be probably depressed. Because the average income level would be lower. So in essence, in a way, if they're not in that income, it makes it a little easier for you to detect that change. What it suggests to you, though, is where you have significant immigrant populations that you suspect are not being counted, that the problem might actually be even more severe than the ratio shows. It's sort of like, I'm sorry, the answer feels a little distorted, but you have to sort of figure out what goes into the ratio and how it works. We had another question. Oh, okay, that wasn't a question. That was a comment. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about this paper by Jeff Lubell. I think it's a wonderful paper. I think it's probably going to appear in a HUD publication in the not too distant future. But when I shared it with Lois, because I thought that it was so well done and so comprehensive, we thought that it would be good to sort of talk it through with you all, because it really is a real nice compilation of the various tools that people have to deal with issues around equitable development. And what we want to do, I think, is sort of talk about the paper some, and then talk about all those tools in the analytics and how you think about it within the context of your markets, because not every tool fits right in every place. And what we want to do is make sure that you're using the right tools in the right places and thinking about all the right kinds of things when you make your decisions about which tools to use. So here we go. Hopefully you all have the paper. I think it was sent out with the invitation to the webinar. If you haven't had an opportunity to read it yet, we're just going to summarize some of this stuff. But one of the things is, firstly, thinking about what it is that you're trying to accomplish. And therein, Jeff creates basically 6 categories of purposes here, which I think are really quite representative of the things that we're trying to do generally when we address these issues. Firstly, we're trying to think about how is it that we can preserve the existing stock of affordable housing, which, by the way, as you saw, is even if we preserve it, it's increasingly inadequate. But at least hold on to that which is affordable. Secondly, how do we think about things where, for example, perhaps the market is changing, but there are people in that market who you'd like to be able to sort of figure out how to hang in there as that market around them changes. So are there tools available, and what are they, that could protect the people who live there at this moment? In some ways, that DRR, that ratio, is a way of seeing where those market changes are creating the protection problem. Next, How do you think about tools which, as you develop new housing, wherever it is throughout your cities or your regions, are there ways of thinking about, from an equitable perspective, making sure that that new housing includes housing for people who are of more modest means, so that lower income households can avail themselves of all the positive things that generally attach to stronger neighborhoods? Next, assuming that possibly that inclusion is not what is going to be able to happen, but maybe yes too, could you use other tools to generate additional revenues so that you could create other housing options? And there's a variety of ways we'll talk about in a moment on how to do that. Next, you have the ability to incentivize creating affordable housing options. So there are a variety of tools that cities around the country have used to be able to essentially say, if you're going to create these units, we could sort of force you, or you could voluntarily do affordable, or there might be things that that we as a city could do that would make it worth your while to create some affordable units along with the less affordable ones. And lastly, the acquisition of land for affordable housing opportunities. Lots of cities these days are thinking about land banking and things of that nature. And cities, lots of cities, whether or not they have a land bank or not, particularly if they're cities like Philadelphia, they have thousands and thousands and thousands of vacant lots, some created through demolitions, other created through just places that never actually developed. But do those areas of vacant land create opportunities to develop affordable housing? So the idea here is, in thinking about your tools, think about them in the context of what it is that you're trying to accomplish. Please.
Should we not also, first things first, understand the market that you're working in? Because our goal is to not preserve inadequate affordable housing, right? We're not looking to, that's a genuine question. Some places we should be strategizing more for a catalytic type of investment in addition to, or can you speak to that a little bit?
Yep, I think that's actually absolutely the case, and my apologies for presenting these things as ors. I think they're probably ands, and when we get later through the discussion, we're going to talk about really a portfolio of activities that you're going to try and accomplish, because although you're dealing in a particular neighborhood with a very specific set of circumstances that you're trying to address, we know you all, in one way or another, have a reason, a public purpose, not unlike our own organization. And the idea of thinking about a tool that might work in your neighborhood, complemented by another kind of tool in another neighborhood, one that's designed to preserve and the other one's designed to protect, or whatever the combination of things are. So absolutely, and to my mind, that decision is really made by an understanding of the market. And we'll talk about what kinds of things within the market that you might like to look at. Now, this is possibly the worst PowerPoint slide that I've ever created in my life. And I would say if you print it, it might be better, but it really isn't better when you print it either. So what I'd like to do with this really is sort of present it in some ways as a template for you, which essentially says, let's look at some of the things within the Lubell paper. And I've created, through the black headings on the rows, those general categories of preserve, protect, include, revenue generation, et cetera. And in the white typeface on those rows, the kinds of things that, that folks do, or that municipalities do, or that housing authorities do within that general context. And then, to Lois's really important question, you'll notice that we've got this chart divided into columns. In some ways, what we're trying to do is to think about, like, okay, so if you're thinking about activities in a declining DRR place, which one of these activities makes the most sense? Or if you're thinking about, it's not like my neighborhood is under great pressure and it's not falling apart. It doesn't mean that there aren't things that you might like to do, and it doesn't mean that there wouldn't be tools within this toolbox or toolkit or whatever metaphor you'd like to use to be able to sort of improve the quality of life in those places. And the increasing DRR places, quite frankly, are, that Point Breeze. And so, how do you think about which of these tools makes the most sense when you're in a place that has these increasing DRRs? So let me just talk about a couple of these things. Some of them that you probably are least familiar with. You'll notice maybe about 5-6 lines down, there's one called the Rental Assistance Demonstration, and that's under the Preserving Public Housing. That's something that HUD has been doing for about the last 4 or 5 years. And the idea here was to essentially offer housing authorities an opportunity to sort of recast the way that their housing is financed so that they could use a small amount of public dollars and essentially leverage a whole lot more private dollars that under a traditional public housing modality they would not be able to use. So for example, you might be able to take a public housing development and under the rental assistance demonstration, convert it essentially to a series of project-based Section 8 certificates, and at the same time, with a small amount of public housing dollars that you get from HUD, leverage private dollars or low-income housing tax credits or other kinds of funding. So this was really HUD's attempt to think through, in essence, how do we take the public housing stock and increase its quality, because frankly, over the course of time, it has tended to deteriorate, not only in terms of quality, and also in terms of numbers. Some of the really neat things that we've done with public housing over the years have actually been associated with the declining number of units. So, you know, in essence, how do you take that existing stock and really bring in new capital to make it better and longer term affordability? Excuse me. So then the question becomes, you know, given that scenario, where might you think about using that? Also, there's one of these tools that I've highlighted in yellow. This is one that was not in Jeff's paper, but I think is an important one to think about. And this is one for particularly for folks who are working in cities where there is a historically significant housing stock. So how do you think about preserving that historically significant housing stock in a way that allows the current owners to be able to stay in those places? Oftentimes, the maintenance on those properties is a little more expensive. The technical aspects of maintaining it, the financial aspects of maintaining it are more expensive. And the question is, are there tools that you could essentially both hold on to the historic importance, the aesthetic quality, and the affordability of that housing stock? There's a couple of really good examples around the country. Providence has a revolving loan fund that's remarkable. It's got decades of experience. Pittsburgh has one as well. So I point that out. Some of the other tools, if people have very specific questions about them, I think Jeff did a nice job in describing them, and I'm happy to go on and describe any of these in more detail. But we do have some questions, right? Some residents are resistant of affordable housing because they associate it with crime. Is there a way to debunk this misconception? So the way to debunk it, I think, is, in essence, is to be honest about it, you know, and to be very transparent about it, and to make sure that to the extent that you can, and where it's necessary, couple that housing intervention with whatever kinds of interventions are necessary. I'll give you a really a tangible example. We have some colleagues who are doing a lot of work in Baltimore, and they're doing it as affordable housing developers. Now, Baltimore is a city, and I would imagine there are some people from Baltimore on here, where the level of crime is really problematic and has got increasingly so over the last couple of years, and probably increasingly so over the last 6 months or 8 months or so. So, you know, like many cities, the police departments are underfunded, understaffed. There are populations that question the legitimacy and then the equity by which the police police. So those are all issues that you got to deal with. But one of the things that our colleagues are doing in Baltimore is teaming up in a very genuine and tight way with local community-based organizers. Organizations probably not much unlike your own, where in essence you are becoming a sort of a voice and a point of order in the neighborhood. We think, and I think that there's good evidence to suggest that where there is other kinds of disorder, crime can take off. Where there is a greater sense of order in street life, where there's a greater sense of order in the physical characteristics of a neighborhood, you can sort of keep that crime problem to a minimum. So to my mind, the best way to do it is, and to the question, is to think about how you marry up this really authentic, community-based organizing and presence in the community as you think about incorporating some more affordable housing. Here's another question. People-centered. Okay, so the strategy seems to miss a people-centered component, and I would say that that's probably right. And when you say strategy, are you saying that? And it's hard for me to tell whether or not you mean the strategies that Jeff have identified or the measurement. If it's the measurement, I would say, yeah, to a degree, although it is measuring household income and home sale prices, but it certainly doesn't touch on the social or racial or ethnic things that attach to those kinds of changes. And by the way, it's an important thing to look at for sure. If you're thinking about some of the measures here, for example, there is probably about a third of the way down the page, there's a group of interventions that are designed very specifically to protect people who are there to stay in those properties. And those are very clearly designed to be very people-based. So for example, thinking about foreclosure mediation programs, or thinking about strategies that help renters stay in their place. You know, I've been struck by a recently completed book on evictions in Milwaukee, and it's become like a book that a lot of people are sort of thinking about and reading and conversing about, because it really is addressing a problem that really hasn't been touched so much in the social sciences, and that is this notion of eviction. And just to give you a sense as to how big it is, when we think about a place like Philadelphia, it's got, I think, roughly speaking, I think I did the numbers, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 581,000 households, of which about 47% of which are renter occupied. So about 290,000, 280,000 renter households, and the remainder are owners. If I were to tell you that in any given year, except for the recession years where we had sort of funny patterns, what you would find is that there are, roughly speaking, 5,000 foreclosures on roughly half of that population of households, but 25,000 evictions. So the rate of eviction, in some ways, if you were to think about it, is probably about almost 6 times as great as it is of foreclosure. And we've tended to focus a lot of attention on foreclosure, but not so much on eviction. I think that if you, for the person who raised that question about the people-based ones, this is something we're actually going to spend some time trying to figure out. Do evictions go up? Like, for example, look at that Point Breeze area, and as that market pressure pushes in from the north, south down from the north and west from the east, will you see a rise in those evictions? And there certainly are a lot of things that we can do to help people who are faced by eviction, not constructive eviction so much, although they're illegal in Pennsylvania, but the kinds of things where, virtually all people facing eviction in Philadelphia go in pro se. They don't have a right to an attorney, and they don't have the wherewithal to hire one. So the kinds of representation and assistance that organizations like yours, housing counselors who are focused oftentimes way more on the home ownership side than on the rental side, but that is the kind of things that you can do. So hopefully that addresses your question. How code enforcement is being used to displace people. The issue of how, within communities and ways to combat that and help owners address code violations was not discussed. This is a serious problem in Baltimore. I could imagine that's a serious problem in a variety of places. So, we created here in Philadelphia an intervention that was designed really to target code enforcement to particular kinds of areas. Now, there are some court challenges at the end to it, but I think the concept is relatively sound. And one of the pieces that was created out of that was an ability of the court to fine somebody up to $300 per day for every non-functioning window and door in a house. So if you think about a typical row house in a place like Baltimore, Philly, let's say it's 2 stories, you probably have a door and 2 windows on the first floor and 2 windows on the second floor just on the front. That's 5 openings. That could be $1,500 a day if they're all not working. So one of the things that in conversation and serious conversation with the judge who was handling that court was, firstly, it was believed that it was a help to have a single judge or a couple judges who focus their attention on these kinds of issues because they get to know the property owners, they get to know the markets, they get to know the sort of the folkways of the community. But at the same time, they're also able to look at the people who are having trouble with these windows and doors. And the judge was very clear with us when he said, you know, in essence, the law gives me the right to fine up to $300 per opening per day, but I don't have to. I have latitude within that. So what I can do is essentially fine that which I think is enough to get the problem remedied without making it so excessive that somebody can't afford to fix their property and they're forced out. So I think, you know, really trying to sort of get thoughtful about the levels of those fines and where the latitude might be in terms of whether or not, you know, the maximum is levied or some more manageable amount is one. And I think, are there any good examples of preserving affordable housing at a smaller scale, not at the public housing development level? Yeah, so I think that, you know, first of all, that revolving preservation fund is a good one. Over the course of 20 plus years, they've really, in Providence, they've really touched, so I used to know the number, but a lot of homes in their neighborhood, but they're probably not touching more than 15 or 20 a year. I think that there probably are, if we could, you know, outside the context of the webinar, we could probably come up with 4 or 5 different examples of places that are doing, you know, relatively small scale but high quality preservation of units without great financial burden. I know Philly and other cities have things like a basic system repair grant program whereby if you are low income and you own your property and one of your major systems is failing, like your heat, your water, your electric, your roof, the city can assess what the nature of the problem is and they can make a grant. I forget what the total dollar amount is, a couple $1,000s to resolve that problem, and it is a grant. So those are the kinds of things that are particularly helpful. The challenge there is finding honest brokers, honest contractors really, to take that money and fix the problems that people are having, not overfix the property and not underfix it and not steal people's money. That seems to me to be the tougher challenge oftentimes rather than the rest. So, in sort of thinking about all those tools, the next couple slides really are just a set of thoughts about how you decide and how you sort of evaluate these things in terms of their applicability in your circumstance. Firstly, and this really goes back to Lois's question, are you really trying to intervene now where you're trying to sort of catch up with a trend? In other words, you're really way up on that and, you know, past that inflection point. Or are you out ahead of it? So you're before that inflection point, but you're seeing evidence of rise around it. So if we were to go back to, you know, Little Point Breeze again, you know, look at where it's actually labeled Point Breeze on the map and watch everything around it. You know, you can see within 4 squares of that neighborhood, there are still opportunities, but you can see the market kind of washing over it. So the idea is really think about, in essence, the choice of your intervention should be conditioned by where you are with respect to that inflection point. Secondly, there's a lot of things out there that people do. And the question is, do they work and under what circumstances they work? So for example, you know, on the inclusionary zoning thing, you know, a lot of places have it and some places have been reasonably effective with it. So for example, Montgomery County, Maryland has, you know, a zoning, an inclusionary zoning thing, which has produced about 15,000 units over a really long period of time, but nevertheless 15,000 affordable housing units. Rent control in New York City, you could be a fan of rent control or not, but there are a lot of people in New York City where 2-bedroom apartment or 1-bedroom apartments are renting for $2, 3, 4, 5, $10,000 who are living in apartments that are, still at that $500, $600, $700 range, commensurate with what their income would allow. Or, again, I don't know if we have anybody from California on the call, but Proposition 13 in California, where your property taxes, this one's meant for owners, where your property taxes were frozen at the point in time that you moved into your house, allowed only to rise with inflation. Now, some people have seen meteoric rises in what their homes are worth, but they could never afford what those property taxes would be were it not for Proposition 13. So, people will argue that rent control and things like Proposition 13 distort the market a little bit, but if your purpose is to hold people in place while financially, these are effective tools. But I would suggest to you, in the strongest way, that you think about the intervention and try and figure out whether or not there's any evidence at all that it really works and in what circumstances it works. And to that point, we have the next bullet here, and that is the intervention designed to work in a weak market or a strong market, or drilling it down in a weak part of a market or a strong part of a market? And, I actually, in preparing for today, I tried to sort of figure out the source of this quote. But, you've all heard this expression, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? Believe it or not, so if you look up who did it, it was Abraham Maslow. Was the becoming self-actualized, the psychologist. So, the idea of, in essence, you don't want to just take something because everybody has one. Everybody's got a land bank. Everybody's got, a property tax abatement. Everybody has this other thing. Well, that's all fine and good, but the question is, will it work in your place? The idea, figure out the tool that will work in your place. Don't just get it and want it because somebody else has it. And the idea of thinking about the market appropriateness and the evidence of success is really the way, I think, to make those decisions. Can the intervention be geographically targeted? We're in a city where we have a property tax abatement for new construction. The city powers have maintained for a really long time that it has to be universal because we have a uniformity clause in our state's constitution. It's not really clear that that's the case because, for example, the city of Pittsburgh operates under the same constitution as the city of Philadelphia, the Pennsylvania Constitution, and they have targeted tax abatements, whereas we don't. But it doesn't change the notion that you should think about, is this the kind of intervention that you can deal with in a targeted way versus a universal way? Does the intervention have a long tail? And by that I mean, it's cool to be able to do something today, but don't forget that down the road somebody's going to have to pay the bill, right? People are starting to find this out with what I think is an important tool potentially in a place like land banks. People have land banks, and they're able to get them started, and they're starting to realize that, many years down the road or years down the road, there are costs associated with maintaining with that property and, marketing that property and insuring that property and all those other things that you have to do. And that's not in any way to dissuade communities from doing land banks. It's just about thinking that any intervention that you undertake really needs to be considered with respect to what are your future obligations with respect to that intervention. And we have a question about, okay, do you have any experience with community reinvestment funds that have been established to support existing homeowners? We're working to create one in our community. So there are a variety of CDFIs like ourselves that are in other places that are way more focused on individual homeowners than we are. For example, New Jersey Community Capital, they have some very direct homeowner products and services that they do. Boston Community Capital in the Boston region. We ran across, I'm blanking on the name of a very small CDFI in the Rio Grande Valley that does some really neat stuff very directly with homeowners. So I do think that there are a set of Self-Help Credit Union, obviously, which is big throughout the South. So the idea of these community development financial institutions, or CDFIs, and we're kind of a heterogeneous bunch, but there are some that do this kind of work. Then we have another one, is Mayor de Blasio announced a 200,000 unit housing goal in 2014 covering a 10-year period. 120,000 of those units are preserving what the city has. None of those 120,000 would be at risk of loss if they were owned by nonprofits. From a policy perspective for new production, what implications does this have for having new units owned by nonprofits rather than for-profits? I think that's a very interesting question, and one of the tools that is discussed in some length in Lubell's piece, where he talks about, converting ownership from a private owner to a nonprofit owner. And I think, there are certainly examples of success in that, and there are examples of problems in that. And the idea is really establishing that nonprofit in a way that it is a highly competent property manager, which is a profession in and of itself. So the idea is, to me, in some ways, it's not singularly the fact that somebody has a nonprofit tax status and has a public purpose, but that the organization has the ability and the wherewithal to be able to maintain those properties, not only as inexpensive properties and affordable properties, but as properties that are assets in the community. So it really is those two things together. So my sense is the read of that tool is that there are examples where it works. There are examples where I know that our organization has had to work some of those out where they have not worked. So it really, to my mind, is a question of being able to actually do that business, and it's not a very simple business to do, and recognizing that it, like some of these other interventions, has a very long tail. So long after the current cohort of people who are working in that nonprofit are gone, there's still going to be that obligation to maintain those properties, and is the wherewithal in the organization to do that. More considerations. Will the funding stream be stable or volatile? That's one that people don't often think about, but a lot of folks are really into trust funds right now, and they're a very wonderful tool for certain things. But recognize when markets are strong, flows of funds into those trust funds are usually good because they usually attach to things like transfer taxes and the like. And when markets are weak, by the way, when oftentimes you might need to make the greatest draws on that housing trust fund, the money coming in is actually quite low because the number of transactions is relatively low. So think about your intervention with respect to, is it sort of a stable and predictable level of financial inputs, or is it one that's going to fluctuate, and do you have the wherewithal to sort of live through those fluctuations, either programmatically by deciding that you're going to fluctuate with the market, or financially, in which case you're going to try and run counter to the market, but that has a lot of financial implications for you. Then there are the Fair Housing Act implications and fair housing implications. To me, I think that from a fair housing perspective, particularly, and this is not always the case in these equitable development questions, that you see a transition of racial or ethnic groups. But where you do, it's really important to think that it's way less expensive, it's way less disruptive, and it's way more consistent with fair housing policy and law to think about ways of keeping people in place than creative and expensive ways of moving them to their next spot. So when you are looking at a market where you're likely to observe the kind of racial or ethnic transition, to me that sort of ups the ante a little bit on thinking about ways of keeping people in place, because the fair housing implications are such that keeping them in place is more consistent with law and policy in that. But there are other kinds of fair housing implications to think through. Those are the most obvious ones I set out. To me, also, it's important to recognize that what Jeff has laid out is a beautiful compilation of all these different tools. My sense is that in most places, you're going to be thinking about a portfolio of tools, a complementary set of tools. So you might have a land bank operating in a particular part of town. You might have tax abatements in another part of town. You might have eviction counseling in yet another part of town. Or you might want to do the eviction counseling and the land bank in the same place. Whatever your circumstances are, think about these not as like the single bullet that's going to solve your problem, but as a toolbox that as you try and solve this problem, you're going to draw on all of those tools to be able to sort of to get some positive result. The regulatory environment is one to think about. As I said, we do have a tax abatement in Philadelphia, My read of the situation, this is my view, not necessarily everybody's view, to be really clear, is when you abate all properties on new construction, cheap ones, inexpensive ones, as well as the most expensive ones, in essence, what you're doing in some ways is fueling that kind of inequity. So for example, our latest quarterback or pitcher gets a $4 million condo in downtown Philadelphia. He's going to get the same tax abatement as somebody who buys a house in some struggling neighborhood if it's going to be a new property. And so the idea of, in essence, do you have things that are exacerbating your problem? And if that's the case, it's not a matter of getting a new tool, it's getting rid of an existing tool or looking to modify that existing tool so that it makes most sense given the constraints that you're operating under. And then lastly, and I'm sure this one you would think about, is what are the legal, financial, and political implications? And to the person who asked the question about, the people side of things, this NIMBY stuff is a concern. That's not in my backyard. So the idea is that sometimes attaches not only to the residents of a place, but to the political leadership of a place as well. And by the way, oftentimes to the community-based leaders in some of these places, and sometimes for legitimate reasons and other times for not. Disentangling all that, dealing with the fact-based stuff and less of the rumor and scare stuff is going to be way more important. So to my mind, in essence, as I go through that Lubell paper and I think about, issues attached to all of these tools and what you all are trying to do in your markets, I say, think about those tools as a way of essentially saying, how are we going to put these things together to create the right set of interventions? Last couple of slides, we don't have many left. This is a map of the city of Philadelphia. You saw a map of it before with a different shading. This shading represents how we've characterized Philadelphia's real estate market using something called the MVA, or the market value analysis. If there are Houston folks on the call, we're getting ready to do this again in Houston. We've done Philly, we've done Baltimore. Hopefully we'll do Baltimore again, I think, in the next year or so, because it would be time. But basically, when you think about this map, and we can go into it at another time, recognize that the areas that are in those salmon colors are the very weakest markets. Those areas that are in those sort of yellow and gold markets are sort of those middle markets, those kind of transitional markets, maybe even light blue. And then the dark blue and purple are our strongest real estate markets. Now, overlay on top of that, as we do in this map, whether or not that DRR is rising or falling. I draw your attention to a few places that I think are really important. So for example, here's an area, by the way, when we were looking at Northern Liberties, we were over here. When I look at this area, I say, well, wait a second, this is a place where there is an increase in our DRRs and it's a middle market area. I say, this is a place where we can get out in front of that market and preserve some affordability. It hasn't gotten crazy yet. It hasn't gotten to where, townhouses are going for $400,000, $500,000, $600,000, $800,000, by its very definition, if it's in this yellow range, those price points are going to be significantly lower. I look at a place like here, down below, for example, the University of Pennsylvania area, and I say also one of these yellow markets where that DRR pressure is great. And I say that's also a place where we can sort of get out in front of that market. When I look at a place where the DRR has been high and it's already purple, what I say is that I'm past that, I'm way past that inflection point already. And so the kinds of tools that I'm going to think about in those places are not going to be the kind of thing where I'm going to be able to go and do like a lot of large-scale acquisition because the price points are just way beyond my means anymore. But for those affordable households that are, or those low-income households who are living in affordable housing in those places, I might be real focused on targeting an ability to keep them in place. Or if we have some problematic property owners in there, particularly multifamily property owners, one of the other tools that Lubell raises, think about working with those property owners to essentially maybe infuse it with some low interest cash or grants or whatever to fix the property up with a pledge to hold affordability within there. Why? Because now you're holding on to affordability in otherwise a really nice, strong real estate market, an advantageous one. To that end, lastly, This is a map of Pittsburgh. I'm guessing there's nobody from Pittsburgh on the call. But what I would like to just point out to you is one area here in Pittsburgh. Now we've mapped that DRR again, and it's the most recent that we have for the city. So you'll recall that that brown area was places where those DRRs were really high. This area inside the green box is an area known as East Liberty. East Liberty is that part of Pittsburgh that really is experiencing its contemporary version of gentrification and revitalization pressures. What we've done here is placed on the map a series of dots that represent where there is affordable housing and its period of expiration, or its affordability period. You'll notice that there is a fair amount of affordable housing in that East Liberty area. Now, the advocates in that community argue that it's not enough. But what Pittsburgh recognized, frankly, when it saw the kinds of things that it was doing in East Liberty would have that upward pressure on the market, that they were going to, at the same time, undertake a set of interventions that would create, hold on, expand that period of affordability for all that affordable housing that was in that place. So they were sort of doing two things simultaneously. They were propping up market and really sort of fueling market at the same time as they were holding on to affordability. So to my mind, that kind of represents a really interesting way of thinking about how can you accomplish multiple things simultaneously. We all want our cities to be vital. We all want them to be prosperous. We know that we have to have a range of housing stock for people who make a range of incomes, from people who are pretty low income to people pretty high income. At the same time, you want people to have opportunity to live in good places and desirable and advantageous places. So looking at these strategies simultaneously, we think makes a lot of good sense. Lastly, this is my way of saying, think about the various tools that are there, think about how they might apply in these different kinds of areas within your community, and then create a portfolio of action. And some of these are not going to happen overnight, as you know. Some of these are easier to accomplish than others. Some of them will take legislation. Some of them will take cajoling. Well, they'll all take cajoling. Some of them will take money. Some of them will take time. So how do you really and by the way, some of them may just take adjustment of what you're doing right now. It's not necessarily you need something new or you need more resources, whatever, but it may be an adjustment of the kinds of things you're doing. So how is it that you think at this array of interventions that Jeff has done such a beautiful job laying out for us, and figure out how you attach them to market condition and create this portfolio of things which will do what it can, do what you can to maximize the equitable development profile of your communities. So with that, what I'd like to do is stop and see if there are any questions. Okay, so we have a question now, which is, do you know about good rent-to-own strategies that have worked? We are piloting a project that is creating duplexes and 8-row houses and marketing them to existing renters that can use the rental incomes to help pay their mortgage. So the short answer to that is no. I don't know of a lot of good examples of that. I know of several bad examples for that. And for those, I don't know, 2 people on the call out of the 100 or so that may know me, you'll know that I spent a number of years working in HUD in the Fair Housing Office, and we used to get an awful lot of complaints about these rent-to-own operations. And I gotta say, in every instance, whether or not it ended up being discriminatory or not, almost every single one of them sort of smacked of unfair. My sense is that they're very difficult to do. The history of these is not great to the best of my knowledge, and I think that if you're going to go down that path, really sort of looking at how everything is set up so that the people who are in that rental stage transitioning to the owner stage are not in a place where they stand to lose everything that they've done, at a point in time, leading up to a point in time when they hit a point in time where they're kind of rocky. Because as you all know, people who are of more modest means, it's not only that their income is low, but it's volatile. And if they hit a period where their income is low and they're unable to make payments for a month or two or three, what you would oftentimes see is that they were unable to be able to sort of meet those continuing obligations of going from renter to owner, and they ended up losing everything that was involved. And I'll say also, there was a lot of that. I think if there's anybody on the call from the Newark area, and I know that there's some grantees there, as I recall, the Newark area had an awful lot of that because housing prices got so crazy in that 2005-06 time period. And a ton of those went to foreclosure. And that was where you had like one property owner, building, or buying a property into which they might have 2 or 3 tenants. And, again, tenants, particularly tenants of more modest means, their income is volatile and their ability to pay is not the same every single month. And so, it's a scary situation. If you're going to do it, you got to go down the path of really sort of thinking through making your way through those periods or working with your tenants to work their way through those periods where their income is inconsistent. Any successful models of Pennsylvania counties working with municipalities to encourage affordable housing preservation on a larger scale? I think that probably some of the folks out in the Pittsburgh area, so that would be Allegheny County in Pennsylvania, are able to do that in a variety of different modalities, both in terms of creating it and in terms of preserving it. And so if the person who raised that question wants to send us an email, I can make some connections with you to speak with the folks who are doing that in the Pittsburgh area. I'd be happy to do that. But that in Pennsylvania is one of the better examples. I mean, there are certainly some things that the city of Philadelphia has done over the years with some success around affordable housing preservation, and we're now doing something in Philly called Healthy Row House Project, where the idea is essentially to try and think through a set of modifications that you can make to a property, particularly in lower income areas, that would make the house both more stable structurally as well as healthy. So that will oftentimes involve things related to lead or leakage or mold or other things like that that do have very direct health connections. So the jury's out on that one whether or not it's going to work because it's brand new, but it's a very interesting and new concept. And similarly, if you want to ask me about connecting you with the Healthy Row House people, I'm happy to do that. Yeah, so this next question is, are there examples of strategies to support moderate income property owners in maintaining affordability in markets where there's pressure to sell to developers or higher priced properties, something other than rental vouchers? I've been really sort of taken by these in the right market, and by that I mean, this historic preservation area. Working with the homeowners to do these upgrades and modifications and alterations and rehabilitations to their properties. And the interesting thing, by the way, about that Providence model is their typical loan is probably in that $15,000 to $25,000 price range. So you're not talking about huge stuff, but you are talking about, the basic outsides of the property to make sure that it's tight and the roofs are not leaking and the windows are tight. Even though, frankly, these all have like old windows that tend not to be tight, they sort of work with the homeowners to make them more energy efficient as well. So I think that those revolving preservation funds really do have some prospects. One of the things we think that distinguishes the really impactful ones from the less impactful ones are the ones where they're not just providing dollars, but they're also providing expertise and almost construction management to help the homeowners through their stuff as they sort of build out their properties. And to me, so that when I look at that area in Providence where that's happening, it's a pretty large neighborhood, but as I looked at the data for that area, it tended to be sort of in that modest to middle income range. And they certainly were the kind of properties that under some different scenario would be sold to, absentee landlords and carved up into 6 apartments, because some of them are quite large. And some of them actually do have apartments in them as well. But this is a way of keeping those homeowners in and sort of tightening up their properties and, creating an asset both for the homeowner, and the community. To that stand.
So, excuse me, it's just about 2:30. I know everyone has been very patient and very much enjoying Ira's presentation, but we are going to wrap up the webinar. If you have any last minute questions, feel free to type them in at this very moment. But if we don't, if there's anything that we see that we weren't able to get to, we'll definitely respond to you via email after the webinar. And just a reminder that we have been recording this, so we'll be sending it out to all of you to share with your colleagues afterwards. And please do let us know if there's any other webinars that you think would be of interest to all of you as grantees. So again, I want to thank Ira and Lois for their presentations today, and we look forward to staying in touch.